I'm Cherie Newman, producer and interviewer for The Right Question. This is Anne Hillerman, author and lovely person visiting us from Santa Fe. Thank you very much for coming. So I started The Right Question in 2007, so it's been going on for a long time, and it is a podcast, and it's also on demand on the Montana Public Radio website, mtpr.org, as well as on the radio. Like, you can turn on the radio and we're just there. You don't have to do anything except push one little button. You don't have to log on or anything. But that's at 7 o'clock on Thursday evenings. It's also broadcast on 7 other stations in various states, including the Four Corners area.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, where a lot of Anne's action takes place in her books. So Anne, because we're not starting out with a moderator introducing us, why don't you just say a little bit about who you are?
Well, good morning, everyone. I was so pleased to be invited to come to the Montana Festival of the Book. So I started out, I am now writing novels, but I started out in journalism. I did that for a long time, and then I kind of segued into writing nonfiction. And then my father was, as you all probably know, was the mystery writer Anne Hillerman. So after my dad died, I was going to say reinvigorated, but that's not quite the word, because people were still reading his books for like the 80th time. But I took over the series and changed it a little bit to give a woman who had been one of his minor characters, to move her into the main role. So is that enough introduction?
That is.
Oh, and I live in Santa Fe.
Santa Fe, right. Spider Woman's Daughter and Rocks with Wings are your first two books in this series, but they're actually books number 19 and 20, right? Your dad published 18 books in the series.
Right.
So as you talked about, you've brought Bernadette Manuelito, Officer Bernie, as maybe is easier to call her, into a starring role in the first book. And I guess the obvious question here is, can you give us a little more information about why you wanted to do this? What was going on in your life, and all of a sudden you said, oh yes, I want to write more books in my father's series?
Well, you know, a lot of journalists really have the dream of becoming novelists. But that wasn't true for me. I had done some nonfiction books. My husband, Don Strell, is a photographer. And so Don and I really loved working together. I did a book on Santa Fe Gardens. I did a book on restaurants. And I also was doing a mystery conference. And so I think this is like, Montana has this same model. Usually in mystery conferences, the organizers pay a lot of money to bring in a big name like James Lee Burke, if you live, somewhere where he doesn't live, and then the people in your state come to see that big name. But we decided, like, New Mexico had so many wonderful writers that instead of doing that, we would focus on New Mexico writers, and that people come from elsewhere to see what wonderful writers we had in our state. So we'd done this conference a couple times. And I think the third year, a writer named Michael McGarrity, who writes police procedurals based in the southern New Mexico, down by the Mexican border. So he was going to talk about the importance of place in his novels. So Don, my husband, who's a photographer, said, why don't I take pictures of the places you write about, and we'll do that as the background to your talk. So my dad was there because he had done a talk at noon, and he was interested in the program. So he was there, and afterwards he said to Don, well, that was pretty fun. How come you've never done anything like that for me? So that gave us the idea that we should do a book of the places that my dad loved on the Navajo reservation. I think because he was such a wonderful lyric writer, I think people who don't live in the West kind of thought he was making it up. You know, how could a sunset be that magnificent that somebody has to pull off the side of the road to watch the sunset? So this is a long answer to your question.
Fine with me, we've got an hour to fill.
Okay. So Don and I talked to my dad, and he said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. So then I reread all of his books, looking for those really juicy scenic descriptions. And then Don and I went on the road for about 3 years looking for these places and talking to people and kind of not only getting the beauty of the place, but also getting the story of the place. So that book was called Tony Hillerman's Landscape, On the Road with Cherie and Leaphorn. And that book came out right after my dad died. And we had really hoped that my dad would go with us on those trips, and that being in that landscape would kind of inspire him to tell some of the stories, you know, some of his memories of all the years he'd spent in Navajo land. So anyway, that book came out, and I had never done any kind of speaking or anything. But the publisher said, well, you guys need to go on the road and do a little book tour. So we would show the pictures and talk about the book, and then I would say, does anybody in the audience have any questions? And the first, second, or third question would be exactly your question. Why are you doing this? Why? Well, before that, it would be, are there any books any more books that your dad was working on? Any books in the Jim Cherie, Joe Leaphorn series? I would have to say no. Dad really took care of business before he died. And then the person would say, oh no, I love those books. I felt like those characters were part of my family. You know, how will I know what's happening with Joe Leaphorn? Really, I was touched with what a close and really sweet connection all these fans had with my dad and his books. So after, maybe Don and I did 20 or 30 programs, and we got that same question. And at that point, I was over the worst of the grief of losing my dad. I thought, well, darn, I am missing these characters too. Really, as much, not quite as much as my dad, but I love those stories, and I just hated to see them end. And even more than that, Dad had this character, now I'm getting to the Bernie Manuelito part. Dad had this minor character he'd introduced her as a rookie cop, and then she was getting more of a professional policewoman. So by his second to last book, Skeleton Man, in that book, she had figured out who the bad guys were. She saved a woman who was kidnapped and found a bunch of stolen diamonds. I mean, she was acting like a full-fledged police officer. But then, because my dad loved the boys, there's a flash flood in the Grand Canyon. Everything is in turmoil. Jim Cherie comes to the rescue. He saves Bernie. He like wraps up the story. So I said to Dad, you know, I think your readers would really like to see Bernie, maybe in your next book or the book after that, actually be on an equal level with Jim Cherie. Maybe not Joe Leaphorn, because he was like the legendary lieutenant, but Jim Cherie. And Dad said, oh, honey, what a good idea. But luckily, I think he was just saying that because he liked me. I don't think he really thought it was a good idea. But anyway, after he died, that idea stuck in my mind, and I thought, I don't know if anybody will ever even want to read this book except me and my mom. But I just can't stand to see this series end with poor Bernie never getting to rise to be a full-fledged crime solver. She will always be remembered as the girl who brought the coffee, the one who drove Jim Cherie around when he broke his leg. No, she's a good character, and she deserves a better end than that. So that was kind of what motivated me to put her in the spotlight in Spider-Woman's Daughter. And I think the other thing was I knew I wasn't my dad, and I knew that if I was going to take on the series, I needed to do something to kind of give it my own voice. So I think those two things were what motivated me.
It's just really a testament to how somebody's imagination can bring characters to life that then means so much to people. It's almost like they're really real.
Yeah, I was surprised at really the depth of affection that my dad's fans had for his books. And I know he said he would get fan mail all the time, and he said a lot of people were really worried about Jim Chee. That was his second detective, because he had so many girlfriends who were so obviously bad for him. And people would send him fan mails. They said, "I know the perfect woman for Jim Chee."
Yikes. Well, let's go back to the landscape, because if you have police officers in a situation in a city, they have a precinct, they might be in cars sometimes, but a lot of times they're out walking on the streets. That can't happen in this landscape. There's a lot of driving. So how do you deal with all of this time where nothing's happening, where a police officer is in a vehicle?
Well, it gives you a wonderful reason to talk about the landscape. And I was so lucky, really, that my dad set these stories on the Navajo Nation, because the landscape comes with so many stories that it's easy, really, the temptation is to get kind of carried away with those stories and sort of forget that you're writing a mystery and you need to keep the action flowing. And in fact, when my dad's books first started getting national attention, he had a review in the Boston Globe. And the writer was kind of lukewarm about him, and he said, just when you think something is going to happen, Hillerman starts talking about the scenery. But the other good thing now, there is some cell phone coverage on the Navajo Nation. So I can sort of use that time in the car for them to have a conversation, or for the detective to just sort of think about what's going on with the case. Or for Bernie, of course, when you're writing mystery, you have to have subplots. So then Bernie can be thinking about her mother or thinking about her ornery little sister. So it's kind of nice, really, to have that time. It's writing a mystery. You have to think about the pacing. You have to have the action, and then you have to have the time to kind of think about what's happening next. Just unlike a thriller where things are just boom, 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 boom. In a mystery, you get that sort of breather time where the reader can think about what's going on and the detectives get a little break. So that's what I can do with that time in the car.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Bernie's family, tell us what's going on with her mother and her sister.
Okay, well, that's one thing that people have really commented on about my taking over the series. When I thought, what am I going to do? I thought I had this wonderful character, Bernadette Manuelito, and my dad hadn't developed her very much. So he had mentioned her mother, and he'd mentioned that her mother had some problems. So I thought, okay, here's Bernie, she's got a full-time job, she's newly married, so of course she's gonna have a mom who needs her attention and who is giving her advice whether she wants it or not. So I had that character. And then I thought it would be interesting to turn up the heat a little more and give her a little sister. And have this sister, there are a lot of unemployment, alcoholism, a lot of issues on the Navajo reservation. And I thought, I'm not writing social commentary or sociology, but I wanted to kind of get into those issues. And I thought that this Bernie's little sister, Darlene, would give me a chance to talk about what happens when you can't really get a job. The education system isn't great. A lot of your friends are drinking, doing drugs, because there's kind of a, I don't want to say hopelessness, but sort of a confusion about where life is going to take you next. So I was able to use Darlene as this character, and also Darlene is pretty funny, like a lot of teenagers are. You know, she's got a big mouth, and she doesn't think too much before she speaks. So that was kind of the origin of Darlene. I'm the oldest of 6, so I had a lot of experience with teenage sisters, and I was still remembering when I was a teenager too. Oh, and then I should also say, when I married my husband, he had 3 wonderful kids, and so I was able to kind of observe them as teenagers, and they were great, but still there were those times when you think, you know, why am I here, and you know, why don't I just go to a resort for a few weeks or something?
Why don't I just go into a coma and wait until they're 25?
Yeah. A resort sounded better though.
Well, let's talk about the culture of the Navajo landscape. My information tells me that the people are the Dene, and the Navajo refers more to the land. Is that your understanding of it?
Dene is what the Navajo people call themselves.
Right.
And the word Navajo was kind of an English corruption of the Spanish word for the Navajo, which basically meant stranger.
Yeah.
The landscape is very important in the I don't want to say origin myth, the Navajo stories of who they are and how they got to where they are. And it's a wonderful, long, complicated story that really puts Genesis to shame. I mean, it's like, if Genesis is this big, the Navajo story is about this big, with monsters and lots of wonderful, exciting characters. But all of those stories take place between the four sacred mountains, and that to this day is the place where you have to live if you need any kind of a healing ceremony. Girls who are becoming teenagers, there's a special ceremony for them. All of that has to be in within the four sacred mountains. The Navajo Reservation is a wonderful, interesting place to write about because it has deserts, it has mountains, it has wonderful farmland, it has streams for fishing. I mean, it's not quite as diverse maybe as Wyoming, but or Montana, but it's really a fascinating place to be writing about. So in my books, setting is really, it was important to my dad, and it's important to me too. That's basically the first thing I think of when I'm thinking of starting a story. So in Spider-Woman's Daughter, one of my dad's favorite books was The Thief of Time, which is set partly at Chaco Canyon, which it's a national park, but it's surrounded by the Navajo Reservation. So I thought it would be fun to bring readers back to this part of the reservation. When in Thief of Time, my dad basically just used the employee housing section of Chaco Canyon, and then he takes the readers on to Anasazi, early Puebloan sites along the San Juan River. I thought it would be more fun to kind of talk a little bit more about Chaco Canyon. So I have a body that's a recent body that's discovered at Chaco Canyon. And I have Bernie and she driving there in the dark and running into a herd of elk. Talking about mysteries, you don't want to say too much, because if people haven't read them, you don't want to give away anything. But I thought it would be fun to bring some of these. That book ends with sort of an ambivalent ending. You're not quite sure what's happened to the bad guy. So I thought it would be fun to kind of do a little sequel to that story. So that part of the Navajo Reservation I use extensively in Spider-Woman's Daughter. Jim Chi and Bernadette are living in Shiprock, so I also was able to tell some of those stories. The story of Shiprock itself, the rock with wings, and how when the Navajo people were in trouble, they climbed onto a rock and it flew them and then settled down where Shiprock is now. And the other thing I thought, since I was new to the novel business, that I would make life a little easier on myself and bring the characters to Santa Fe, where I live. So I was thinking, how can I do this? And Bernie had never been to Santa Fe, so I thought it would be real interesting to see what she thought of it. So that was part of my thinking, to bring them off the Navajo Reservation just a little bit as part of the story. Santa Fe, of course, is full of museums that have all kinds of wonderful things that archaeologists, anthropologists collected from the Navajo. So I was able, in that story, to talk about the legacy of Hosteen Claw, who was a wonderful singer, weaver, medicine man, back at a time when people were thinking, when Native Americans all over the Southwest were in trouble, and people were thinking maybe the Navajos are not going to survive. Their population was going down. There was a lot of, the boarding school movement was going on, the language was being lost. So anyway, Hosteen Claw decided that he would weave sand painting, the stories of sand paintings, into his rugs to preserve them. And he also worked with not exactly an archaeologist, anthropologist, but a woman with deep interest in linguistics and Indians called Mary Cabot Wheelwright. And she recorded a lot of the Navajo chants, and then they built a museum in Santa Fe to preserve them. So it was, even though it was Santa Fe, it was still had a connection to Navajo culture.
There's, excuse me, there's one point where Bernadette thinks that that she can't think negatively after Joe Leaphorn is shot. And I'm not giving anything away because this happens like in the first 2 pages of the book. So Joe Leaphorn is fighting for his life in the hospital in Santa Fe, and she thinks, I wonder if he'll live. And immediately her mind goes to, no, I can't think that way because of her upbringing. And so you're bringing culture into the book and explaining how the Navajo people and the Dene people think. And she's thinking about the holy ones and how they say you're never supposed to think negative thoughts. So how tricky is that to put that into your story while not offending anyone whose culture that is? I mean, you're not Dene, so.
Yeah, actually, the Navajo people who have helped me with the books are happy to see that, because they're, as you all know, there's a lot of difference between Native Americans all over the country, and the Navajos have a very sort of inclusive idea. There are Navajo clans that are named after Mexican people who joined the Navajos, that are named after Pueblo people who came to live with the Navajos, and they accepted them. And their idea is that their sense of how the world works would really benefit everybody. So they were, I mean, and I think the idea that negative thinking isn't good for you is sort of a kind of a new age idea too. That, you know, if you are constantly dealing with depressive thoughts, it's not good for your health as well as for your mental attitude. And that's kind of the same idea that the Navajos have. If you focus on the negative, bad things are going to happen to you. And so, I mean, that was kind of what Bernie was thinking. If she wants Joe Leaphorn to get well, she can't think of him there in his injured position. She has to either visualize him well or just not think about the negative. Yeah, the Navajo people have been very actually happy, and also happy to see themselves as powerful people who are solving crimes. I mean, this isn't a case where the Lone Ranger comes in or the FBI comes in and takes care of things. The Navajo cops are savvy and well-trained and use their cultural elements as well as their police training to solve the crimes.
I think your dad was an honorary member of the tribe, right?
Yeah. And he was so pleased that they used his books in the junior high and high school. I mean, they thought, the Navajo people themselves were aware that as technology crept in, they were losing a lot of their culture. So they used his books for like kids to read in the 7th and 8th grade to sort of get back in touch with what was important to their grandparents.
The technology is something that I thought about when I was reading your books, because part of your father's writing was that he was always sticking this conflict between traditional ways, non-technology, and technology, and non-traditional ways into his stories. So that created conflict. It's got to be a little bit harder these days to do that because, as you said, there's cell phone coverage on the Navajo reservation. How are you dealing with that?
As best as I can.
You just have the cell phone coverage go in and out?
Well, and I don't even have to make it up.
Yeah.
Well, you guys, I'm sure the same is true here. You know, you have mountains, you have places where there are very few people, so there's nothing in it for the cell phone towers to go up there.
So your conflict is maybe the younger people, like Bernie's sister, trying to find their way between the traditional ways and what they have to deal with in the modern world.
Yeah, that's right. In Rock with Wings, I'm able to bring that theme up again. There's a gentleman who is a solar energy company wants to put solar panels on his land, and it's like he he, like a lot of people who've been around for a while, is not particularly receptive to change. But he has a grandson who is, you know, trying to kind of urge him on. So it was fun to play with that conflict too.
Yeah, he didn't want the solar panels because it was going to ruin his view of the mountain he was used to looking at. Well, in that story, we're talking about the second book now, Rock with
Wings.
With Wings.
Somebody calls it Flying Rocks, but not quite.
You have taken Bernie and her husband Jim and put them kind of at opposite ends of the landscape to work on two crimes. And one of them, which was really interesting, was something that was happening during a movie shoot in Monument Valley. And for people who don't know, Monument Valley is very famous for movies, the settings of movies. And what was that idea where Jim was that based on something that really happened? Are they still shooting movies out there?
Oh, they sure are. Well, originally I was going to just have one big plot and have Bernie and Jim Cherie working on it together. And I worked on that book for probably 6 or 8 weeks, and it was just flat. It didn't have any juice in it. And I couldn't figure out what the problem was. So I have a dog, and we go for a walk every morning and we talk about stuff. And so as we were talking about this, I realized that poor Bernie had been a sidekick for like 10 books, and she was not having it. It's like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not, no. So that was then when she had to come back to Shiprock and basically take care of her own story while Jim Cherie was in Monument Valley. After Don and I did our Tony Hillerman landscape book with all those photos, the group that used to be called Elder Hostel, and now they're called Road Scholar, called us and they said, we would like to do a tour based on your book and based on your dad's books. So Don and I, and they asked Don and me to go with them. And they said, you know, Don can talk about photography here and you can tell stories of your dad. So that was what we did. And so we went to Monument Valley, I don't know, 6 or 8 times. And every time we were there, we would go out with a Navajo guide. And every time the stories were different. And some of them would sing to us. And one time when we were there, Johnny Depp was there, remember, with his dead raven hat? And they were doing the new Lone Ranger. And so that stuck in my mind because it was just so totally bizarre. So I thought, so I thought, well, gee, and really Monument Valley they do a lot of movies there, commercials and music videos. So I thought this would be kind of fun.
This might be a good time to introduce your husband, Don.
Oh, yes. Stand up. And this is our grandson, Taryn Reinecke. Stand up. Taryn is a Montanan, but he's not from Missoula. I'm not going to tell you where he's from because people from Missoula have some.
You live in Bozeman. You live in Bozeman. We like bobcats. Well, it must have been really fun for you to go out and work on the images for the book with your husband. And did any of that experience come into your plot with Bernie and Jim when they were together and then you wanted them to be apart?
Yeah, probably. I think doing the close reading of all of Dad's books. I mean, and at the time that we were doing Tony Hillerman's landscape, I had no idea that I was going to be writing novels. And my dad and I had never talked about me continuing the series, which I think is good, because I think if he had said, would you, I would still be terrified. I would still be there on the first page of the first chapter of whatever the first novel would be. But anyway, that close reading really gave me kind of a good sense of the characters and how they spoke and how they interacted together.
Because you had to go back and actually do research in all 18 of his books to find the locations.
Right, and the first time, probably like any of you who've read him or read any mystery, you're reading to see what happens in the story. But when I reread them, I was really reading more for the nuance. for, how does he, like you're saying, when people are driving and you have all that empty time, do you just fast forward, say he got in the car in Santa Fe, there he was in Window Rock 3 hours later, that's one sentence, or do you use it to, for other things? And I think I learned a lot from reading those books about how to handle that, and I'm still learning. I mean, I have to say every book is like the first book.
What's your, I guess, biggest surprise about taking on this project?
Oh, that's a great question. I think how receptive Dad's fans have been to changes in the series. A lot of his fans, he wrote the first book in 1970, and I talked to people who say, yeah, I went to his book signing in Albuquerque, and there were like 8 people, and he read to us, and so those people were still reading. So still reading the series, and to think that they at this point would be receptive to a big change, having a woman as the main character, really was very encouraging and heartwarming for me. I wasn't sure how people would react, because some people, you don't like change, and I'm not my dad, so I was very edified. That was a surprise to me. And I guess the second surprise was how closely people read, and how some fans are not hesitant to remind you of things you've done wrong. And also how people say, I know a great site, I know a great plot idea. It's been a really wonderful experience with lots of surprises. The other surprise was how much there's like the whole writing introverted part of being an author, and then there's the part like this where you get out and talk, and how kind of schizophrenic that is. I'm sitting at my computer, day after day, just me and my imaginary friends, and then I'm out dealing with 500 total strangers. It's cool, it's fun, but it was not what I had expected.
And those strangers are treating your imaginary friends as if they were real.
Right, some of them probably know them better than I do.
I'm sure they do. What else do you want people to know about your first 2 books? You've got another one coming out next spring, I think.
Right.
Or your writing process, or anything else?
Oh, well, I never realized how much I would like blowing things up and setting them on fire. It's like, no. When I wrote Spider-Woman's Daughter, I knew, lots of times people write a first novel, and because there are so many, hundreds of thousands of books published, no, it doesn't really get much attention. But I knew because of my name that my first book would get some attention. And I also knew, as I was saying, that people would be fairly critical, because my dad had high standards. So I thought, whatever I do here, I have to get people's attention right away. So that was how I came up with the idea to kind of get things started with a bang. As Cherie said, I thought of all the characters, poor Joe Leaphorn is the one who has escaped pretty much unscathed throughout the series. And I thought, if I'm going to have Bernie be a crime solver, at this point in my career, I don't think I can handle 3 main characters. So I thought I'm going to need to do something to pull one of them back a little bit. So that was.
So you shot him in the head.
Yes, I shot him in the head.
That pulled him right back.
But I figured that maybe people would give me more than 5 pages to see how things worked out.
Well, I want to open this up to questions shortly, but first I'm going to look at these notes that I haven't looked at and see if there's anything I wanted to ask you. Oh, you wrote about a skinwalker in your second book, and I was curious. There was a little bit of information about the skinwalker in the book, but what can you tell us about that?
Skinwalkers, shapeshifters are part of a lot of native cultures, and the Navajos have very serious ongoing beliefs about these creatures. They're people who can change themselves into animal shapes or into birds, and they don't do anybody any good. You don't ever want to see them. There are lots of stories of, usually at night, people hear scratches on the windows, scratches on the roof, people see something running ahead of them that's evil, basically evil. So it was a challenge in Rock with Wings because I did not, this old guy who sees the shapeshifter the first time is kind of, he's been living by himself a long time, and he still is in touch with reality, but he also sometimes goes into that dream space. And I did not want to ridicule him. I wanted to treat him respectfully, but so I wanted the reader to kind of have a little confusion. Is this real? Has he imagined it? And it was tricky to do it.
Well, you did. I was confused. Well done. Okay, Connor's gonna go around with a microphone because, as I said at the beginning, I'm hoping to get a good enough recording to make this into a right question program. So I'd like you, Connor's gonna hold the mic, please don't grab it, but just ask your question into the mic.
You mentioned that you were the oldest of 6 siblings, and I was wondering, is there anybody else in your sibling group that is a writer? And do you think the name Hillerman has helped you? And then also, are they looking at you and saying, why you, dang, I wish I would have been the one that did that?
Oh, those are good questions. Well, all my siblings are adopted, and none of them have been interested in writing particularly. The sister who's closest in age to me is a visual artist. And so she did the illustrations for Dad's children's book, The Boy Who Made Dragonfly. They're really beautiful. It was first UNM Press published it, and my sister did those illustrations, and then HarperCollins reissued it, and they had an artist from the Czech Republic, and they're both of them are beautiful. But my sister's, that story is set at Zuni Pueblo. It's based on a Zuni story, and my sister's illustrations look much more like Zunis. She is finally a reader, but for a long time she was a mom, and she didn't spend much time reading. My next brother is an airline mechanic, and he also is dyslexic, so he reads for information, but he just now has started reading for fun. And then my next sister really is not a reader, and I don't think she even ever read Dad's books. And then my other brother was a cable TV installer and watched all the movies that Redford made of Dad's books, but again, he wasn't a reader. And my youngest brother is a pharmacist, and he says if it doesn't have pictures, he doesn't look at it. So I mean, it's interesting when you think of genetics versus environment. You know, we all grew up with parents who loved books, who loved stories. And when we were having our family dinners, you know, we would all us kids would talk about what was going on, and often my mom would talk about what book she'd been reading. And so I think from an early age, it was, to me, you know, stories, fictional stories were just as valuable as the stories that happened in our own lives. Yeah, the Hillerman name has been enormously helpful. And I was lucky when Don and I got married back in the 70s. I said, well, at that point I had been writing already, and I said, you know, I'm not going to change my name. He didn't. I said, you could change your name, but he didn't. And there was a third part of that question that I forgot. Okay, well, okay, thanks.
So you said you've got a next book in the works, and I'm wondering if there are more beyond that. I'm sort of selfishly looking forward to a long relationship with Bernie.
Well, Gwen, you should introduce yourself. This is a wonderful Montana writer who's asking this question.
Gwen Florio.
Gwen Florio, yeah, she's this. You have what, 3 books now?
3 books.
Yeah. So after I'm gonna backtrack to answer this question. So when I had Spider-Woman's Daughter in kind of a good enough shape that I thought somebody besides my mom and I would want to read it, I talked to my dad's editor at HarperCollins because I was a little concerned about copyright legal issues for those characters. And she said, oh no, go ahead, this is fine. And she said, you know, when you're done, feel free to show it to me. I'd really like to see it. So when I finished it, I showed it to her, and she said, oh, I like this, I want to publish it. And at that point, I thought, gee, maybe I should have an agent. And so I had never worked with an agent, but anyway, because of doing the conferences, I knew some agents. So the agent then was working, and the agent said, well, I had said to the editor, or the editor said to me, I think, we'd like to have you do 3 books. I said, oh, this is good. So then when I got this agent, she said, oh no, we just want a contract for 2 books. I said, oh. She said, no, I think these books are going to be good, and then we can go back. Well, she didn't say good, but she said something like that. She said, then we can go back and renegotiate and get you more money. I said, whoa, all right. So Rock with Wings and Spider Woman were on the first contract, and then I signed a contract for 3 more books. So the book I'm working on now, I just finished, Song of the Lion. That'll be out in April. And I'm working on the 4th, and then there'll be the 5th. And I don't know after that. Everything has its time, and I might decide that is enough of this series. Or I noticed the book I'm working on now, I had a subplot that I thought was so juicy, I kind of pulled it out to be in book 4. So maybe as I keep writing these books, I'll get more and more ideas on how to continue them. So I don't know, but thank you for asking that question. It's really so nice to kind of know what you're going to do with your next 3 or 4 years.
Well, this is a question about a part of the Spider-Woman's daughter. The thing that touched me or surprised me the most was the sharing of the getaway vehicle. That was a piece of, I don't know, culture amongst that age group on the reservation that completely took me by surprise, but really spoke to something. I wonder how you came across that.
Just from talking to people, and somebody would say, oh, I got a car, but so and so has it, and then his brother was using it, so it was like kind of like an extended family. Yeah, so, and I thought that, I don't know, it just seemed like it was another way to kind of keep the reader guessing while talking about some cultural elements. Yeah, I would love to. Another element in Spider-Woman's Daughter is rodeo, and my mother's family had the oldest business in Oklahoma. They were there. They were harness makers and saddle makers, and then they went into the bootmaking business, and then they went into leather goods and saddles and bridles and all. And a lot of their business was rodeo, and particularly Indian rodeo in Oklahoma. So and the rodeo is huge on the Navajo reservation. So I got into rodeo a little bit in that book, but that's another thing I'd like to get into before the series ends. So thanks for that question.
Any other questions? Connor's a grad student in fiction. He's learning a lot today.
Well, after multiple years, I went back to university and have finished a novel, but unpublished. And mine concerns like the Blackfeet people, and I've run into the situation where traditional versus what people talk to me about is, I'm a modern Indian. I don't have anything to do with that. And so did you run into problems between the two? And
Yeah.
I'm finding it's kind of hard to not step on people's toes.
Yeah, but the good thing about writing fiction is it is fiction. I mean, I can have people maybe people who wouldn't normally be quite so traditional have a little more investment in their tradition for the sake of the story, and also I can have people who maybe would have some traditional memories, practices, have totally abandoned them for the sake of the story. But yeah, and I mean, there are 350,000 Navajo people, so of course, like in any population, there are people who have basically they see all that stuff as kind of superstition and what's been holding them back. And then people who see their whole kind of cultural, spiritual connections as what really makes them, what has given them the resilience to have survived the their own Long March down to Bosque Redondo, Kit Carson's efforts to exterminate them. They kind of see that as what holds them together as a people. And there are a lot of efforts among the Navajo people to encourage the language, encourage tradition. Dene College now has all kinds of classes on the Navajo language and Navajo beliefs, so kids who didn't get it from their parents or their grandparents can kind of pick it up later in life.
I remember back in 2007, I interviewed a writer from the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, and I asked him about his childhood, and he said, "I grew up just like you, watching cartoons and eating cereal on Saturday morning."
Yeah.
So it just depends on who your parents and grandparents are.
Would you talk about your writing process, what your day is like, and how long it takes you to complete a novel?
Sure, I'd be glad to. It took me about 3 years to write Spider-Woman's Daughter, and part of it was that I was, besides writing a novel, I was learning to write a novel. And so I would reach points where I thought, it was funny, I went to a panel that Gwen talked about yesterday. You reach a point where you think, oh, nobody in the world is gonna ever wanna see this, and why didn't I just get a job as a waitress? But after, so that one took a long time. These other ones have been quicker, in part because now I have a deadline for them. A lot of writers say you have your whole life to write your first book, and then you have a year to write the second book, and that's kind of true. But having had a journalism background, having a deadline really helps me use my time well. So I get up in the morning, and my dog, Sally Sue, canine investigator, we walk around, and I kind of talk to her about what's up. And then I get home and bring in the paper and make some coffee, and then I check my email, and then probably about 8:30 or 9, I will get to work. And I try to work no matter what is going on in the world or in my life from 9 until noon, solidly. And then I'll have lunch, and then I realize, oh, I need to find somebody to do the plastering, all of the other things of life that you have to deal with. But so I maybe will spend a couple hours doing that, and then I try, if things are going well, I try to go back in the afternoon and do some writing. If things are not going so well, I try to go back in the afternoon and do some research, or maybe do fan mail. Fan mail kind of buoys my spirits. People say, oh, I liked this or that, or how did you get the idea for this or that? And that kind of makes me think, yeah, maybe I know what I'm doing. So, and so, maybe I'll do some more writing in the afternoon. A lot of writers like to write in the evenings when things are quiet, but I find if I write in the evenings, then I can't get to sleep. So I don't write in the evenings, but as deadlines get closer, I will get up earlier and do more writing in the mornings. And then when I'm done with or at a point in a draft where I think maybe the story is pretty much together, I have some friends who are writers who are also excellent editors, and who will tell me the truth, who will read it over and say, gee, I don't know what happened here, and how come this character, you introduced him and then we never see him again. And they're really, really good at kind of keeping me on the straight and narrow. I used to use my mom for that. My mom was my dad's first editor. I honestly think if it hadn't been for my mom, my dad would still be writing his second book. But my mom took care of all the details of daily life, and she was sharp as a tack, so she would read his books, or she would talk to him when he got a little stuck and kind of help him through it. And she was such a wonderful, generous soul. He'd say to me, I'll let Marie read it, and if Marie says, gee, I'm not quite sure what you were doing here, he said, I knew that meant it just really stank. And she helped me with Spider-Woman's Daughter, and she was the one who came up with the title with Rock with Wings. So now that she is not, she died last year, and now that she's not with me, I'm trying to kind of make up for her by imposing on all my friends, or my friends who are willing to take on this job. So yeah, so that's sort of my process. And then, of course, then you send off the book, and then it comes back, and the editor has questions. And some of the questions are really good, and some of the questions come from somebody who lives in New York, who doesn't understand the West. And so anyway, at first I thought I had to answer all the questions, and now I realize some of them I can answer, some of them I can just ignore, and some of them maybe the question itself is pointing to something major that I need to change. So anyway, I'm kind of learning to sort of play it by ear a little more, and to have a little more confidence in my own ability in the end to work through the problems in the process.
We have time for one or two more questions. Anybody back there have one? Okay. You have another one? It's okay.
Do you ever binge write where you hit a streak that it's working? And, because now my husband becomes quite insulted when I go, "Get out of here!" And scream at him to go away when it's 6 o'clock and he wants dinner on the table.
Well, I shouldn't tell you this story with my husband in the room, but so we'll just pretend he's not here. So I have in my office, I have like a little single bed, and mostly I use it for stacking things up. You know, but once in a while it will be empty, and when it's empty, he will come in and sit down there to talk to me. And I love him to pieces. I don't want to be rude to him, but sometimes the timing is bad. So I try to sort of, give him like the one-word answers and hope he'll just lay down and go to sleep. But yeah, that's the wonderful thing about writing. Sometimes in the panel yesterday, somebody had a wonderful comparison. It's like you're in an airport and you're on the moving sidewalk. And it's like effortless, you're just flowing along, and then the sidewalk ends. So when you're on that moving sidewalk, that's when suddenly I realize, oh my gosh, it's 1 o'clock and I was supposed to meet somebody for lunch at 12:30. That's great. And then when the sidewalk ends, that's when for me, I have to stay in the space. I have to stay writing something, even if it's awful. And eventually just kind of the mechanics of typing the words, whatever the blockages will clear up. Yeah.
One more.
You've addressed this in some ways, but I'm just interested in your life with your dad when you were younger and your family. Did you ever go with him to the Navajo Reservation and his research times? Could you just talk a little bit about early life with Tony and your mom?
Sure. Well, my dad also worked as a journalist until the late 60s. In our early days, he would work 40, 50 hours a week. He would come home, and then after dinner and after all of us kids were in bed, he had a roll-top desk in his bedroom, and he would go in there and type away on his old Royal typewriter. And he loved New Mexico. So on the weekends, maybe on Sunday afternoons, we would get in the car and go for a little drive. Since we were living in Santa Fe, it was a long way to get to the reservation. But sometimes we would go there. I remember we went to Canyon de Chelly when I was a child, and that was when they would. Now you go with a Navajo guide, which is really better. But when back in the 70s and the early 80s, you could drive your car down there yourself. So I remember we were all in our little station wagon, and we got there, and the guide said, "Well, you all should be careful because there's quicksand." So all of us kids were so excited. We'd seen all the African movies where people sink. But no, we didn't sink. But by the time my dad went from journalism to the academic life. He worked as an advisor for the president of UNM, and then he started teaching journalism, and then worked part-time teaching creative writing. So that was really the period where he was able to focus more and more on his books. And then when he retired, of course, then he was writing full-time. And that was when he was able to make more trips to the reservation. He would say, talking about getting stuck, he'd say if he got to one of those places, he and my mom would get in their little truck and they would go to the sites that he was writing about. And that movement out of the office into the landscape really loosened things up for him. So he would talk to me when Don and I would come down from Santa Fe once a week and see Mom and Dad. And sometimes if he was working on something that he was really proud of, he would motion me into his office. I think maybe Don came too, or Don was probably talking to my mom. Anyway, he'd motion me in and he would read it to me. And I still really treasure those moments. I can just see the excitement in his eyes. And you know, it's interesting having written for all those years that still creating that wonderful scene, that wonderful dialogue. It was just like he was a teenager. He was so excited about it. And I think that his passion for his work really kind of gave me permission to be a journalist and then be a writer. So, yeah. Thanks, Dad.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks to Beth Ann Ostein for recording. Thanks to Connor for recording the questions. Is that MCAT back there? Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. I know it's Saturday morning with so many juicy things in this book festival. I really appreciate you being here.
And you'll be out signing books right now and answering questions, right? Is that where you
Sure.
go next?
If there are.
Okay.